Okay. If you have anything to say that you don't want to be recorded, you can always send a note or something. If you have questions, you can, it's a small group, so you can just unmute yourself and ask a question. And you could also use the chat. I'll try to monitor both. And at the outset, I just want to acknowledge and welcome Mrs. Tovit Krakowski to our gathering. She has two claims to fame. She is the Machatonister of Paul and Linda Sager, which is pretty important in our community. And also, she is the daughter of Rabinovitch Zatzal. And so it's really a tremendous honor to be discussing the work of such a significant person, the life of such a significant person, in the presence of a family member and a daughter. So really honored that you're joining us. And I want to give you the floor to share some reflections, and then you're welcome to then correct everything I say that's mistaken. But I want to give you the floor for the first minutes, and I guess I can ask you to unmute, and you can just please share a few minutes of reflections about your father and as a person as we begin.
Sure. Thank you very much. So thinking about my childhood, well, I'll just say I am the oldest. I was followed by 5 sisters and brothers, and I was born in Dallas. At age 3, we moved to Charleston, and we were there for 8 years, and then moved to Toronto for another 8 or 9 years. And then I was kind of out of the house, studying in Israel. My family, meantime, moved to London. And for the next 12 years, my father was the head of Jews College there. I really was very far away from the family after age 18, because either I was in Israel and they were in America, or I was in America and they were in London and then in Israel. So thinking about my childhood, well, one thing that now is, it took me years to realize this difference, but my father was always home. I mean, when we were in Charleston, he was the principal in the day school, which of course I attended. So he was in school with me, basically. But he really, he was home a lot, and working in his study all the time. When he wasn't at home, when he was home, that's what he did. We were always free. There was never, we were never afraid to go into the study and ask for help with something or ask a question or whatever. It was not like that. My father he never appeared to be pressed for time, ever. I guess he was a man of routine. We definitely had our family suppers every night. He was kind of a little bit in charge of bedtime and making sure that everybody got into bed at a time that was too early for my taste, but whatever. And also helped get us up in the morning. I did kind of get a lot of, like, I see that I have many, my worldview has been very much shaped by my father, but it was never in a very direct way. I don't even know exactly how he did it. For example, I mean, I'm the only one of my siblings who isn't living in Israel. All of the others, even before my parents moved, 2 of them had already moved there on their own, and then the others quickly followed. I don't know, it just kind of, we absorbed that somehow. I know that we were living in Charleston. It was the Deep South, and there was segregation. And somehow I knew that it was wrong. I knew that my father considered it to be very wrong. And I remember I was probably 10 or 11, and a classmate, it was a very tiny class, I mean, said something derogatory about Negroes. And I was like horrified, as if I couldn't understand. I mean, he was somebody who was Shomer Kashrut. How could, and this seemed to be like, you know, so so I feel very privileged to have absorbed a worldview that I feel it's healthy and sane, um, on all kinds of issues. I mean, he used to, I think in later years, he used to even preach a lot against not you know, used to preach a lot against magical thinking, and I think that that's very, very common in our society, but somehow I always knew that that didn't make any sense. Well, you know, we as children, I mean, thank God we had a normal family life. My parents didn't go on vacations per se. We would visit family in Baltimore, and we went on outings to the zoo and so forth. I might mention in that connection that in Charleston, I had a cat, an outdoors cat. And actually, I had several in succession. And the truth is, my father was very fond of animals. And so he was, well, I was too young probably to appreciate the zoo, but we were always being dragged to the zoo. So, and yeah. What else? Oh yeah, I should mention this as well. He was the one who taught me how to ride my bike. I'm not sure if he taught my siblings, he may have, but he definitely taught me. I may have learned how to sew a button from my mother, alaiha shalom, but my father was the one who taught me how to do the knot at the end. So, yeah. Now, I want to say a little bit more about, because people don't, you know, people don't realize certain things about my father that I think are very important. When we came to Charleston, there was a lot that he had to do. He was about, I think he was about 28 at the time. And first of all, he had to unite the two shuls. That's a story in itself, which I'm not going to say now. But then after a year or two, he had to build a school, basically, which included raising all the funding. And then after he managed to get commitment, you know, enough commitments to actually start building the school behind the shul, as a matter of fact, he then had to recruit children to join, and it wasn't easy to do that. There were Shomer Shabbos families in Charleston, and they, in fact, one of the reasons that my father chose Charleston after Dallas was because there was a group that their stores were closed on Shabbat, and eventually, unfortunately, blue laws were passed, and some of them didn't succeed in maintaining that. But at the time, there were many stores that were closed on Shabbat. But the population, you know, most of the population, they weren't that enthused about the idea of a Hebrew day school. So he literally, and my mother was always fond of relating this, he went from house to house and knocked on doors and begged people to send their children to the school. And thank God the school is still thriving today, Adelstone Hebrew Academy. I think you did, Rabbi Wolkenfeld, you saw it, right?
I visited. I spent a weekend in Charleston about a year before I moved to Chicago, and I visited the shul and I visited the school, and yeah. Still.
So he did that, and just on the side, you know, he also was teaching calculus in the College of Charleston. And when we moved to Toronto, so he was not a principal anymore. Okay, So he was with Rabbi Felder, he was the Beis Din,
Mhm.
and he also continued to teach in university. And my mother encouraged him to pursue the doctorate that he'd given up when she became pregnant with me, and he felt he had to go to Dallas and get a job now. So he'd given up finishing the doctorate. She encouraged him to do that in Toronto, and he did it, and his doctorate was published. Um, so somehow or another, he found time for everything, and he never gave us the impression that he was a man who was in a big rush, and other people have reported the same thing. People were calling him constantly, and he always had time for everybody.
What was his doctorate in?
In the history and philosophy of science, and what the university published, his doctorate was about it was about probability and statistics, notions of probability and statistics in the literature from the Talmud and through the Middle Ages, examples of that type of thinking, of probability, statistical and probabilistic thinking. So yeah, that's.
Thank you so much, and please interject and correct or offer additions as I speak. I think what I amongst these colorful pictures of family life is really like invaluable and just incredible to hear. Very grateful for. And in terms of just the sense of a man whose career began serving small congregations, and I think throughout his life, when he became even as a Rosh Yeshiva, even as a publisher of significant halakhic opinions, I think just he never forgot that that foundation in serving a community, and like that one-on-one, that personal touch, that they're individuals you're accountable for, and I think that plays out in some of the halachic material that he published and some of his activism in recent years. So I just think that beginning, that the story you told of the Charleston years, I think it really, you can, I think that you can trace a lot back to those years, I think. And so maybe we'll see together how ways in which that was true. I'm going to share a source sheet with you all. It's a Google Doc, so I'm going to just put it in the chat. So you should all be able to open it on your own if you wish, and follow along. It's where is it? Right here. Okay.
How do I open this?
There. So I just shared a link in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So
one of your grandchildren's going to help you.
Right, good.
Yeah. All right. I'm just going to
should be able to click on that link and see. If it's difficult, I can share my screen, but I think it's easier if you all do it that way. It's not necessary. I'll speak, but I just collected a lot of the.
I see it.
Great. Okay. So so this is born in Montreal. Studied with Rav Hirschsprung, who was significant, like the chief rabbi of Montreal, a very significant figure in his own right, from a European immigrant to Canada, who sort of built Orthodoxy in Montreal, and got smicha from him, I think, at the age of 20, and then went off to graduate school in Baltimore, where he got smicha again from a Ruderman at Ner Yisrael. These dates are from Wikipedia, which does not include Dallas. So Dallas is missing here, but it has the significant stint in BSBI in South Carolina, and where he taught mathematics as well in Charleston. And then 1963, he came back to Toronto, finished his PhD. The dissertation is called Probability and Statistical Influence in Ancient and Medieval Jewish Literature. So that was published in 1973. Just saying about statistics, statistics is a relatively new field of mathematics, but it is like very well, like it's a significant issue in as far back as the Mishnah. Like the Mishnah includes all these cases of you bring in korbanot and they get mixed together, and various permutations of your korbanot are mixed, and you have to figure out what how you figure out which ones to offer. So probably, and Talmudic literature discusses kosher meat and non-kosher meat that you find on a street with butcher shops. Unidentified meat you find in a street, and 9 out of 10 butcher shops on that street are kosher. So what can you assume about the meat that you find? So probabilistic thinking was definitely something that Chazal grappled with and Rishonim grappled with, but I think the modern mathematical language for probability didn't exist until centuries later. And I think that was sort of left to people like Rabinovitch and some others as well to kind of like translate the halachic probabilistic thinking into mathematical language. So we had a statistician, a PhD in probability mathematics in the shul a few years ago, who I believe tracked down and read this dissertation and some of the other more recent literature on trying to describe the probabilistic thinking of Chazal and of the Rishonim in modern mathematical language, which is not something I can do, but I very glad that someone did it. Went from Toronto to London, where he had a Jewish college. We spoke about Jewish colleges 2 weeks ago when we spoke about Rabbi Sachs, among the more illustrious, famous graduates. And Jewish College is an interesting institution in Anglo Jewry, right? It's sort of training rabbis and Jewish professionals for a nominally Orthodox, but not necessarily so observant community. It's a traditionally oriented institution, but it's not a yeshiva, and it really shaped English Jewry in a very profound way. And from Jewish College, Rabinovitch went to Mein Aliyah, and in Israel, he was the Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim, which is a Hezder yeshiva, which is a yeshiva that combines yeshiva study and army service. In terms of institutions of like modern Judaism, it's interesting to contrast. Like, the American modern Orthodoxy is very much a product of the university, right? Like that's like the crucible of American modern Orthodoxy. It's where it's of Orthodoxy meets general science and liberal arts and modernity. In Israel, the central institution of modern Judaism is the Hezder Yeshiva, right? It's the place where commitments to Orthodoxy meet up with commitments to the state and to the nation in the context of army service. And the Hezder Yeshiva is sort of, if you sort of want to compare American modern Orthodoxy and Israeli religious Zionism, you can compare what it means to have a Judaism that's forged in the university and a Judaism that's forged in the confrontation with the army, the accommodation with the army. Hezder is a very demanding program. It's a 5-year program. It's 2 years of yeshiva and then 3 years in the army, and then you return to 3, 2, 1. 2 years in the yeshiva, 2 years in the army, and then that's 2, and then 1 year back in yeshiva at the end of the 5th year. So it's a demanding course that sort of a commitment to take on. And it's there are a number of yeshivot Hezder, and they're considered, I think, a success of Israeli religious Zionism. So the yeshiva Ma'ale Adumim, I know people who study there. I think I was talking to a colleague in preparation for this class, and he said to me, it's really telling. He said, I've known like 2 students of Rabinovitch from the yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim, and they're both such decent, humble people. And I think that also reflects on, like the people who lead an institution. I think their character reflects on people who study there. One Rav Yoni Rosenzweig is somebody my age, a younger rabbi in Israel who's, I don't know, like several years ago already, he already published like 4 volumes of halachic writings, like very prolific writer, an activist for the halachic support of those with mental illness, and he student of Rabbi Rabinovitch, and such a decent, humble person and helpful person. And I think that's says something about the yeshiva and how it was shaped by Rabbi Rabinovitch over the many years that he was there. In 2015, he served as a senior rabbi for a project called Gior Halacha, which is a really controversial and I think really important and positive initiative in Israel. And I think it also says something. You accrue a certain amount of capital. Like, what are you going to use it on? Okay, you have a reputation for tremendous scholarship and for piety, and you have students, and you're admired, and at an age where you could certainly retire and rest on your laurels. And Rabinovitch dedicated his considerable capital, considerable reputation on support of this project. Gior Halacha is literally like halachic conversion. Okay, so the idea is, let's provide a means for an Orthodox path to conversion that is outside the controls of the Israeli state rabbinate. For people who find the Israeli state rabbinate's conversion process to be overly onerous or overly bureaucratic or even in some instances corrupt. And this was a way for Orthodox rabbis to provide an acceptable, decent, like high quality, meticulous conversion path outside the state rabbinate. So that's very controversial. And I think, and I think important, and I think it comes from, we'll see, I want to make sure we have time to kind of discuss, it comes from a certain theology that Rabinovitch wrote about and developed about the role of religion and state, very much explicitly influenced by John Locke, the great Enlightenment thinker, English thinker and philosopher, but Rabinovitch thought it was like rooted in Tanakh and rooted in Jewish history, and that led him to feel that the state should not be involved in matters of conversion. Like that's not the role of the government to set conversion standards. This really separates him from the dominant stream in Israeli religious Zionism. Again, if American modern Orthodoxy is forged in the university, the confrontation between Orthodoxy and sciences and liberal arts, if the Israeli modern Judaism, religious Zionism has been forged in that confrontation with commitment to orthodoxy and commitment to the state and to the country and to the nation through army service. And so that's that sort of sanctification of the government, of statehood, which epitomizes the dominant stream of Israeli religious Zionism. Rabinovitch really rejected that. As a fervent Zionist, and even a right-wing Zionist, he rejected the dominant strain of relation to the state, which sanctifies or gives over to the state this authority for religious matters. So if the religious Zionist yeshivot, there's a group of yeshivot called Yeshivot Hakav, the yeshivas of the line, okay, toe the line, okay, like Merkaz Harav and Har Hamor, which are associated with the kind of Chardal orientation, the Haredi Leumit, and part of their ethos is inspired by one interpretation of Rav Kook, the interpretation by his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, that sees the state itself as the embodiment of God's will manifest on earth. And so the institutions of the state are also holy. So to set up a conversion process outside the authority of the state, in opposition to or contrary to the wishes of the state, the government to have monopoly over these types of processes was very controversial and remains very controversial. But again, it's really important, especially for immigrants, all sorts of people who made their lives in Israel, who've joined the Jewish people, align their fate to the fate of the Jewish people, and they find the process that the government sets up to be overly onerous or overly bureaucratic. And he was again associated with that initiative for the last years of his life. Okay, so I have a list here of selected publications. I have this is not articles, just sort of books. So Hadar Itamar, I don't know much about. That's an early work. I have the thesis. Okay, then next 1973, probability and statistical inference. So he published a work of history of science. Darkar Shel Torah was published in 1998. That was his, which I think has not yet been fully, much of it has been translated into English, but I think not in fullness. And then which is his sort of philosophy of halakha and his philosophy of sort of his legal philosophy. Milumadei Milchama, that was his guidebook for soldiers, which is again an important it's a genre that's really important for rabbis associated with the yeshivot Hazer, because their students serve in the army while they're in the midst of their yeshiva studies. And so you need, halakhic, that's like halakhic matters of, your commander gives you 15 minutes to say shachrit, okay, in your army base. So what do you do? How do you set up an Eruv at an army base if you're stuck on base for Shabbat?
It's basically they would write to him or call him with their shilas. Yeah. It's shilas and shuvas, just like
I thought it was a guide. Okay. Okay.
No, okay. It's chuvos.
Oh, good. Okay, so it's like actual things from his students. So it's like real. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So great. Thank you. So it's the full range. So the full range of experiences that soldiers experience in the army, which is, profound ethical concerns about, military ethics, and also very mundane issues of observing mitzvot under very, very challenging conditions where, your time is not your own, and your space is not under your control, and kashrut maybe isn't as good as it should be always. And so you have to make responded to students even there. I mean, that's I spent a year in a Hezbollah yeshiva, and I really have a sense that, like, to be in a successful Hezbollah yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva have to really care about their students when they're out in the army, and they have to visit them, and they have to be really invested in their religious success and their psychological success when they're out in the field, not just when they're in the Beit Midrash. And that's and so that was a product of his as well. Siach Nahum is the book that I've read and that I own, and that's his collection of Shalom Shuvot that was published relatively recently, 2008. I got a copy a little bit later. I'm trying to think. Sarah went to Israel without me for some trip shortly after it was published. I know she got a copy and brought it back for us, and she told me a day or two ago that when she bought it, she bought it at our copy. Kind of. The books of Chavruta, the bookstore in South Jerusalem in Katmon. And so she bought it, and she sat on the steps and like looked through it and like had to see. She saw what he had to say about. She picked a topic that was like important to her: women dancing with the Sefer Torah and Simchat Torah, and she, a controversial topic that's important to her. And she saw what he had to say about it before she even left the bench outside the shop. And then I guess so. Misilot Bilvavenu, I think, is like a more expansive collection of his thinking about halacha and Judaism, like it's sort of, which that does definitely not exist in English, and I think it should. And then Yad Pshuta, his sort of, I guess, magnum opus, which is an extended commentary on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which is it's not just a like massive project. It's like it's like literally like a project from another century, okay, right? Like, who writes like a line-by-line commentary in the Rambam? Like, who's the last person to do it? It's been centuries since someone has like done that. So this is a tremendous accomplishment, and the ambition to do that. I mean, last week we learned about Rav Steinsaltz, he wrote the first line-by-line commentary on the Gemara since Rashi, okay, right? For 800 years, everyone thought Rashi was like, there was no need to write like that kind of commentary on the Gemara because Rashi did a pretty good job. And Steinsaltz thought, Rashi obviously did a great job, but there's more to say, or there's a different kind of, people in our generation need something different to guide them through this text. And Rabinovitch, out of his just devotion to the Rambam and his way of thinking and deep immersion in his writings and thoughts, felt that he could contribute by writing a commentary in the Rambam, and it's good. Okay, it's a good commentary in the Rambam. It draws from the full breadth of Rambam's writing to answer questions like on specific points of specific details are explained by recourse to the breadth of the Rambam. So it's a very Rambam focused commentary, right? It's not trying to be fancy by drawing in outside sources. It's trying to explain the Rambam in his own words within his own worldview. So it's just a tremendous accomplishment, and that just, again, it harkens back to an earlier time. So I want to spend the remaining time we have. I want to talk about some of these tshuvot that I find particularly important and interesting, and I also want to talk a little bit about some of his philosophical writings, which I think can explain. I think they're important in their own right, and maybe explain his involvement in Giur Halacha and those types of initiatives that are kind of really bucking the trend in Israeli religious Zionism. So, okay, Orach Chaim 36, he says that has a very lenient position about fasting for pregnant women and nursing women. And I guess just in my immediate circle of friends and colleagues, this was really like revolutionary, or like really incredibly impactful, at least in my circle of friends, and at least impactful to people who consult me about these questions. I was telling somebody recently, sometimes I find out about the couples who are expecting babies, around Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, right? People have, I'm pregnant and should I fast or whatever, in these days. So that's, I find out when like the babies are born, but sometimes I find out earlier when people consult about fasting and Yom Kippur. And I would say, like, just thinking of my own children, and like, just our oldest is 15, and I had not encountered Rabinovitch's psak when Nahum was born. And I think Sophie is 9, right? I also not, and Sophie, we had remember consulting with rabbis before. Sophie was born in November, so the Yom Kippur before she was born, we had like extensive conversations with rabbis about whether Sarah should fast on that Yom Kippur. And I think, I was asked the doctor, and the doctor was like very, a little bit shocked by the question. It was like a very unpleasant experience. But it was like a classic halachic experience, right? The classic halakha is, unless there's a specific danger, a woman in good health can fast while she's pregnant, and a postpartum mother can, once she's after a few, 7 days, the Shulchan Aruch says after birth, she can fast also on Yom Kippur, even if she's exclusively nursing to feed the child. And Rabinovitch, first of all, says, he does a number of things in his, and I've heard it's just that this was inspired by like real encounters with like negative outcomes from people who fasted, and that sort of, it was again like that interaction with real people as a rabbi who takes responsibility for actual people, right? Not writing theoretically, but responding to real people, encountered negative outcomes from women who fasted, either pregnant or nursing, and that pushed him to reevaluate. And what he demonstrates in this tshuva is, first of all, that Tisha B'Av, despite its like heightened significance, nonetheless is a rabbinic fast only, right? Not a Torah fast, which is sort of obvious, but like it's like essentially ikar hadin, essential halacha. It should be treated as a rabbinic fast, like the other minor fasts. And so, someone in any degree of danger should, is entitled not to fast on any degree of health danger, entitled not to fast on Tisha B'Av. So that sort of takes it, and therefore, a pregnant woman or nursing woman has a right to kind of see herself in that way. And Yom Kippur, he says that eating and drinking, or drinking especially, can reduce the risk of dehydration. Dehydration is necessary for nursing, and dehydration is necessary, or preventing dehydration is necessary to prevent bad outcomes in pregnancy. So he says after 5 months, you shouldn't fast on Yom Kippur either, because of this risk of dehydration. And he says even a baby that's full term, this is like, even a baby that's full term. So like doctors will often say, we have an OBGYN, doctors will say the risk of fasting when you're full term is it may lead to labor, right? Like dehydration may induce labor, but if you're full term, so that's not such a bad thing. But Rabinovitch says no, and even 1 day early, okay, 1 day earlier than, is medically like ideal. Like that's not, we don't mess around with that. Like that's a concrete risk to the healthy outcome of this pregnancy, and we don't do that even 1 day early. Or even the baby. Let's say the baby's due date is Yom Kippur. I think you would say, like, if the baby's supposed to be born on that day, like it'll be born on that day without being induced by fasting. So I think that's a stance. Again, it's really, I think, is change the experience, right, for people. And my colleagues, I think, rely on his position and give that advice. And I know, certainly people in our community have followed that advice on my guidance. And in terms of nursing, he says that a baby is entitled to a reliable food source. And if the baby's getting a substantial part of his or her nutrition from nursing, and fasting has the risk of interrupting the mother's milk supply, that's like the baby's food, right? And like causing a sudden abrupt shift in a baby's diet is like not healthy for the baby. And so you shouldn't do it. Okay. Avoid that situation. Do what's necessary to avoid putting the baby at the risk of suddenly having to switch their diet, or switch to formula, or switch to whatever, and abruptly, okay, because of the mother's fasting. So it's not a very long tshuva, but it's a well-argued tshuva, and I think it's a important tshuva. I think it's one that's really changed things. The other tshuva I wanted to discuss, next one I want to discuss with you. Yes, this is usually Shabbat and electronic locks and motion sensor doors, where this is a question that's comes up increasingly here in Chicago, as more and more of the high-rise apartments are putting in electronic doors, and have electronic motion sensor doors for the lobbies of their buildings, and more and more buildings are doing away with mechanical keys altogether. And and Rabinovitch answers that question in the context of like a hotel. So that's like, which is maybe 1 or 2 Shabbatot, and then you go back to your normal home. So it remains it's a further judgment call to see how you wish to, or how appropriate it is to apply the leniencies that he develops to a situation of that isn't and it's more regular, like your own apartment. But either way, it's still an increasingly common hurdle in our world. So I think here you see his like scientific training does him well, and he points out that electricity is not it's not, as people once thought, it's not fire go traveling through wires. Okay, so all of the biblical prohibitions of manipulating fire, lighting fire, extinguishing fire on Shabbat are just not aren't relevant for electronic manipulating electronic devices. There is no fire in the wires. It's not what electricity is. There were some Chazon Ish, whose yahrzeit was just this week, who suggested that maybe electricity is bona, you're building something, you're completing a circuit, but that was already decades ago rejected by Rosh Hashanah Auerbach, who says you're not completing something when you close a circuit, right? When I close a door, I'm not building a wall. When I open a door, I'm not demolishing a wall. I'm operating a door. Okay, it's more akin to a folding chair. We all open folding chairs on Shabbat. We're not building a chair. We're operating a folding chair that's meant to be open and closed. And it's really the same. When I turn the switch on my radio, I'm not completing a radio. Okay, that was like I'm operating the radio. It was complete when it was off. Now it's on. It's two states of a radio, just like there are two states of a folding chair, open and closed. The radio has an on state and has an off state. I'm not completing anything when I turn on a radio. Nonetheless, we have a strong tradition not to use electronic devices. So not to use electronic devices on Shabbat, maybe the category Udin Dechol, it's like a weekday activity. It defines our Shabbat, super important to refrain from electronic devices on Shabbat. I think that's one of those distinctive religious practices of Orthodox Jews, and like maybe our big contribution to the world. Like you can survive a day without electronic devices. But it means that when there's a countervailing value, we sort of have a little bit more wiggle room if there's no like strict biblical malacha, one of the 39 prohibited Shabbat violations entailed in electronic device. So sometimes there is, right? An incandescent light bulb, you're heating, a little filament gets so hot until it glows, like that's probably a biblical prohibition. If you have an electronic lawnmower that's cutting your grass, that's a biblical malacha of kotzer, of cutting the grass, right? But if it's like a LED sensor that's going to go every time I open my door, my alarm system, a little green light goes on somewhere in the closet. That's not a malacha. It's an LED light, which it has no filament. And I don't care about it. I'm not even perceiving it as I open and close the door. And so that's fine. An electronic lock, there's no malacha. It's just a lock unlocking in my hotel room. Like that also, he said, it would not be a problem because there's no malacha. And the use of this electronic device is enabling me to like leave my hotel room and go to shul, or like go out to eat lunch at someone's house or whatever, do all the things that are necessary for having an enjoyable and pleasant Shabbat. And so it sort of forces us to have conversations about is this activity consistent? If I can use an electronic lock, why can't I put on my television, right? So I think that the answer is obvious to someone who's observed Shabbat, but it's needs to be explained and articulated, but at least in terms of doors and motion sensors and things like that, I think those are becoming an ever more present part of our life. And people who live in cities and in rent apartments in cities, it's going to be a part of, it's going to be harder and harder to avoid those issues. And as our homes become more wired and they're smart homes that send that, that the thermostat adjusts to our presence, et cetera, so in your own home, maybe you can have a Shabbos setting, but maybe you don't have to, and maybe you can be more comfortable, and maybe it's not necessary. So he, I think, laid a lot of the foundations for, I think, like cutting edge, Hilchot Shabbat. That is a way to enable people to observe Shabbat in hotels or in high-rise apartment buildings, and leaving the foundation for future conversations about how exactly Shabbat, how to protect Shabbat while also enabling it to be lived. I want to talk about two more tshuvot. So tshuva from Montreal about some initiative that was undertaken to limit access to the mikveh to certain types of people. It wasn't exactly clear, who they wanted to exclude from the mikveh, but they wanted, somebody to exclude some people from the mikveh. And Rav Hirschsprung, whom I mentioned before, was his great teacher in Montreal, and Rav Felder, who was the next, in line in big important Canadian posek, They had said the mikvah could be open to anyone to use, but there was some initiative to be a little more restrictive about who could use the mikvah. And Rabinovitch is like angered by like it's like an insult that somebody would dare to be like, how could you be more from than Rav Hirschsprung? Like, how could you? It was good enough for him. Like, who's opening their mouth to say it should be different? And that's like a big sense, I think, of like animating his tshuva, like his devotion to his teacher and his sense that his teacher, like, established the mikvaot and had set the foundation for Orthodox life in Montreal. Like, there's no need to question those assumptions, but he also, he argues the case on the merits and points out that in the Mishnah, it's obvious that first of all, that the operation of the mikvah was the responsibility of the Beit Din, right? In Eretz Yisrael, that's one of the things the Batei Din did. It says in Masechet Shkalim, right? That I think it's that the one of the reasons that the half shekel that was raised was like to maintain the mikvaot in Eretz Yisrael, to enable people to travel to Yerushalayim in purity. So this was it was like a communal responsibility. It's also clear from other sources in the Mishnah and the Tosefta that these mikvaot were used by everyone, that non-Jews also used the mikvaot as well. And like the Mishnah tells you, like, how do you interact in a mikvah that Gentiles are also using? And so these same mikvaot that the Batei Din were supervising and fundraising for and operating were used by everyone, and like that's a pretty good precedent. Like our mikvah too, okay? Like the Orthodox community can take responsibility for fundraising and building and operating and maintaining a mikvah that is then a resource that's available then for everyone to use. Okay, I think a mikvah that's like that would be, I think, our mikvah. Okay, the Adam Ashras Memorial mikvah is a mikvah that it's not a community mikvah; it's an Orthodox mikvah under Orthodox auspices, but it's a mikvah that's available to everyone. We don't, bar the door to anyone to use it, and and if someone wants to use it in accordance with Orthodox halacha, we can help them do that. And if they want to use it for some other reason, like we're not going, we don't stop them. That's not our role to stop them. It seems that seems like a very obvious model, but it's not as frequent. I think once I spoke about this and I compared it to, if you imagine going to a restaurant, you're going to a dairy restaurant, and before they serve you, they ask you like, how long has it been since you ate meat? Before, we can't bring you your, you ordered lasagna, I see, right? Can't bring it to your table. Tell us how many days it's been how many hours has it been since you ate meat? And what if you say, well, actually, my practices and my family is we only wait 3 hours. And the waiter says, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. Like our standard is 6 hours. I'm not going to serve you lasagna. And it's kind of ridiculous, but that's really precise. That's how most mikvaot operate, right? They're not going to let you use it in a way that they feel is problematic, is less than ideal. That's it doesn't have to be that way, okay? And I think it's very powerful tshuva and important tshuva. Okay, and the last one I'll talk about morning. He talks about children and the morning practices and the 3 weeks and the 9 days leading up to Tisha B'Av, and he grapples with the question of the Talmud says Ein chinuch la'avelut. There is no education towards mourning, and he offers like a very I think insightful interpretation or limiting interpretation on that statement, which divides that statement to the two types of avelut, because there's avelut that mourning practices that we mourn for a relative, for a father, mother, husband, wife, sister, brother, son, daughter. We have obligations to mourn for relatives when they die. And then there's the mourning practices we engage in leading up to Tisha B'Av to mourn, and on Tisha B'Av itself to mourn the Beit HaMikdash. And so he says that when the Talmud says, Ein chinuch la'avelut, there is no education towards mourning, that refers to mourning for the Beit HaMikdash. It does not refer to mourning for a relative, because he says, like we hope, or we don't, hope is the wrong word, but we expect, and even like the best possible outcome, the best is that our children will one day be mourners, right? Like we want our children, right? If all goes well, our children will one day be mourners for us, and that's like the good outcome. And so, therefore, they need to be taught how to do that. Whereas we hope that by the time our children are adults, the Beit HaMikdash will be rebuilt and there won't be a need for them to mourn on Tisha B'Av. So we don't educate around mourning the Beit HaMikdash because we don't impose restrictions on children the same way as we might impose other mitzvot on them, because our hope is that if we do our job right, then there'll be a Beit HaMikdash for you, and you won't have to mourn on Tisha B'Av. But even if we do our jobs right, especially if we do our jobs right, our children are going to be mourners for us, and so that there's some education that's appropriate around that. So that was a very thoughtful and again, wise kind of observation about the human condition that then is translated into various halachic, practical implications as well. Policies for day camps during the summer and whatever, and et cetera. Okay. I have some long passages from Darka Shel Torah, which was published in English, The Way of Torah, in an early volume of the Edah Journal. And two ideas that are expressed in the passage I brought, and I think they're significant. The first is a clear articulation of a kind of Maimonidean ethos that the Torah includes mitzvot, and the halacha codifies mitzvot that we are meant. That's a floor, not a ceiling, or mitzvot that were necessary for the time and place in which the Torah was given, but are not reflective of God's ideal vision for humanity. So one example that he gives is, so two classic, he gives the example of slavery, he gives the example of polygamy, okay? So the Torah presents an ideal of human equality. Every human being is created in the image of God. Every human being is the descendant of Adam and Chava. Every human being traces the lineage back to Gan Eden. No one has yichus that's better than anyone else. And that's that truth that's there in Breshit is that's the highest truth. That reflects, God told us that so that we could build a society based on that truth. But the Torah was given to the world at a time and place in which slavery was endemic. It was seen as necessary in all sorts of ways. And so the Torah, allows for slavery with various limits, maybe severe limits, but that didn't reflect the ideal. And as human beings live with the Torah and study Torah and humanity develops and in all sorts of ways grows more attuned to God's will, we can transcend that particular social evil and build a society that doesn't include slavery. And polygamy is another example. Okay, obviously, monogamy is, I think, the Torah's ideal, right? The first couple was one man and one woman, and the patriarchs who had multiple wives. It's clear in every single instance it was not their first choice. It was that was a plan B, okay, and that led to tragedy. I think monogamy is a pretty clear ideal of the Torah, despite the Torah's, our patriarchs having multiple wives. And so Rabinovitch writes, so at some point in time, it was possible. Okay, at one point in time, it was possible to do away with polygamy, and we did. Okay, and that was a good thing. That was a good thing. So I think this is Maimonidean, I think, but I think applies it in a maybe broader way. And Robin writes this way explicitly about the animal sacrifices, right? God doesn't need animal sacrifices, but we wouldn't have taken the Torah seriously had it been given to us without animal sacrifices. Every religion worth its salt had animal sacrifices. We needed it to take the Torah seriously when we got it at Sinai. So God threw in animal sacrifices, but we don't need them. And the fact that God doesn't need them, right? Or pure religion doesn't need them. God doesn't need them, and maybe one day we'll transcend the need for animal sacrifices as well. So it's an interesting question within the Rambam of whether we've transcended yet the need for animal sacrifices, because he includes them in Mishnah Torah as part of the third Beit HaMikdash. But I think he's explicit that it's there in the Torah not because God needs it, but because we needed it, given the time and place in which the Torah was given. So that much is there in the Rambam. And Rabinovitch says this type of ethical development or spiritual development and progress is something that exists in other mitzvot as well. The other idea that he wrote about in this essay, the Darka Shel Torah essay, is that he develops a distinction between, there's now at the bottom of that third page, sorry, the bottom of the second page, the laws that are come through the authority of the king versus the Beit Din versus the Chachamim. And so we have a tradition of religious law from Moshe to the Chachamim, in all generations who taught Torah and taught mitzvot. And then one period of time we had a king. And why do we need a king if we already had, all the laws from the Torah and we had rabbis to interpret them? What was the king doing? So the king was, providing for the common defense and protecting the community and issuing all sorts of legislation for the betterment of, the king could enforce speeding tickets, right? It can decide, the king could decide, regulations for the sale of donkeys. Okay, that was not a halachic matter. That the king could sort of enact these types of laws for a well-functioning society and to protect the society. And after we no longer had kings, that we had, and as Jewish kihilot maintained, he felt through history, this dual center of two centers of authority. There was the rabbi who would, study Torah and teach Torah and give halachic guidance. And there were also, Jewish communities had, shivatu, they had town councils, and they had parnas, so they had, a sort of a lay president, right? There were other other communal leaders separate from the rabbinic class, who could, would raise taxes and make sure the orphanage was well funded, make sure that the medical care was provided to everyone in the Jewish community who needed medical care, and took care of people's bodies and took care of the health of the community through their ordinances and taxation powers. And so throughout history, we had these two spheres of authority, the religious sphere and the secular maybe is the wrong word, but the pragmatic sphere of authority. So at one point it was king and prophet or king and sage. And then in the medieval period, it was in the kihilot system, it was the rabbi and the heads of the lay leadership of the kihilot. And he felt that the modern state of Israel, these two functions continued, and that the Knesset took over the role that had been the domain of the lay leadership of Jewish communities in the diaspora, or the role of the king in ancient Israel. And therefore, he felt the Knesset it was illegitimate for the Knesset to legislate around matters of religion. Okay, that's the job of the rabbis. That's the job of religious leadership, to provide religious guidance, to encourage, right, to create the best possible likelihood people would make of their own free will good choices to do mitzvot and embrace Torah. And the job of the Knesset is like the job of the king, which is to provide for the common defense, to enact legislation to help the society be well ordered, but not to interfere in religious matters. I think that explains why he was willing to lend his support to efforts like York Halacha. And there's now a major privatization of religion going on amongst Orthodox Jews, and conversion, marriage, kashrut, right? It's and in this current government, there's even maybe some traction, to get government approval of this, opening space for independent religious activity, right? Kashrut, I think right now, there was a big, the religious affairs minister, I think, is promoting a bill to allow for private kashrut organizations, which is illegal now in Israel. It's illegal for a rabbi to say this restaurant, this factory is making or serving kosher food. The state bureaucratic rabbinate has to authorize a product as kosher in order for anyone else to offer their own kashrut supervision. And so there's now efforts to maybe change that, maybe allow for greater privatization in kashrut. The kashrut supervisors are very upset by this. They had a protest at the minister's house, I think yesterday, where they fried shrimp as a protest outside the Ma'oz Kahana's house. So this is controversial, but I think so. Rabinovitch, I don't know precisely in all of the nuances of this politics and but Giyur Halacha was a big step in privatization of religion, and saying that Orthodox rabbis of the most senior level can endorse conversion, a very sensitive issue with ramifications for multiple generations that's taking place outside the confines of the state bureaucracy. And so that again reflects a kind of a deep Zionism and commitment to the state, but not the sanctification of the state. Let's see. All right, I think we're about the end. Any questions or comments? I said I spoke for a long time. Any reactions or follow-up questions before I can, I have links here on the sheet for some secondary literature. I would say Alan Nadler's article from Jewish Review of Books is a wonderful, loving portrait of Rabinovitch, written, published just a few years ago. Alan Brill's essay is a very overview of his philosophy and really rooted in the Darkei Shel Torah, that essay. And David Silverstein's, who published David Silverstein, it was, Rami Schwartz's piece, which was just published very recently, The Political Theology of Rabinovitch. That's a very good, that sort of explains the sort of division of not church and state, but king and sage, okay? And how that has modern ramifications. And Rami Schwartz shows how Rabinovitch was explicitly rooting himself in John Locke, but he claimed, John Locke was, maybe just an articulation of the biblical model anyway. And Yoni Rosenzweig wrote a beautiful, beautiful sort of loving hesped for his teacher. And I think that's sort of worth reading as a sense of just how a student can sort of appreciate a teacher who empowered the student to just also, do really great things in Torah education and halachic writings. So I was so encouraged for the reading, for the secondary readings as well. Okay, questions or comments? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording then. Thank you.